Good afternoon. Feels funny, I don't know whether to stand up or sit down. I'm Stephen Forbes. Welcome to the panel session. I'll very briefly introduce the panellists. We've got a fantastic panel. Elizabeth Farrelly is going to speak first, so I'll mention her first, or second after me. A Sydney-based columnist and author who trained in architecture and philosophy, practiced in Auckland, London and Bristol, and holds a PhD in architecture and urbanism from the University of Sydney, where she is also an adjunct associate professor. And I think for those of you that have signed up to the conference, you will know Enrique Garcia. So I don't need to say anything more there. And Lord Mayor Stephen Yarwood from the City of Adelaide, thank you very much for making time to come along. Adelaide's youngest ever Lord Mayor, although we're ageing him as rapidly as we possibly can.
Very true.
A town planner with nearly 20 years' experience in state and local government, Stephen has dedicated his professional life to developing cities. Stephen has an MBA as well as postgraduate qualifications in regional urban planning and environmental studies. He's worked as a researcher in Parliament, as a principal planner, and lectured in planning and management in several countries. So we can probably start the first slides. I should just give you an outline of the format. So we're just going to each say something for about 5 minutes, and then we'll hand it over to you if you want to engage in some questions. If you don't, we'll just talk quietly amongst ourselves and try not to disturb you. I will just start also by acknowledging that we are on Kaurna land and acknowledge that the spiritual and cultural beliefs of the Kaurna people are as important to the Kaurna people today, but also I think one of the things that we've learnt in the conversations is how important they are to the rest of us, and there's a great deal that we can learn from that spirituality. So let's start off just by talking about what the topic is. Is this going to work?
You're connected.
Oh, there we go. Beautiful. So the question, one of the questions that Enrique asked is, what's the best habitat for people to flourish in an urban environment? And best spatial habitat, it's actually a very difficult question to answer. And we might say that a habitat that contributes to social cohesion, health and well-being, creativity and livelihoods is the sort of habitat that we would like to see in a city. And we'd also, as part of the theme of the conference, has been green space as something that underpins urban habitats that enable people to flourish. So where does that take us? Because my contention is that declining budgets and increasing demands for buildings, roads, parking, pipes and wires have driven a shift in our approach to green space to a focus on risk and cost rather than a focus on opportunity and benefit. And I'd suggest that today, where the drivers for urban green space are as much essential service, in Australia at least, are as much essential services legislation looking after gas, electricity, communications, water, sewerage and road safety legislation than they are about the needs of the of the best environment or the best habitat for people to live in. So the starting point in this conversation is just to reframe green space as green infrastructure. And you can go, well, why would you do that? But it really is trying to expose the choices in urban habitats between built infrastructure, buildings, which we all know, grey infrastructure, which really are the roads, the pipes and the wires, and green infrastructure. And green infrastructure is essentially anything that's got chlorophyll in it, apart from toothpaste.
So anything that what?
Got chlorophyll in it.
Oh.
That wonderful substance that traps sunlight and turns it into energy that we utilise. So there's that distinction, I think actually helps us to frame a discussion around a city that we see three elements: the buildings that we live in, the grey infrastructure that we really see as a service, and the green infrastructure, which is a critical part of our livability, of our social cohesion, our health and well-being, our creativity and our livelihoods. That's a pretty significant reframing, and in South Australia we've been working on a green infrastructure working paper in the context of the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide to try and make that shift. The challenges are really common to many areas of our endeavour. The challenges are, what's our vision? What are we looking for? And how do we share a vision as to what a city should be? What are the governance arrangements? Where does this all join up? How do we have the Road Safety Committee and the Essential Services Commissioner on the same page as planners that are working on green infrastructure? And the last one is the capacity. The engineering in built infrastructure, engineering and architecture is pretty well defined. And same in the grey infrastructure. When we get to green infrastructure, we're inclined to drive the dollar as low as we can go. We don't want to pay people that manage our green infrastructure well. We look for contracts that are the cheapest possible contracts to deliver a service. We don't actually think a great deal about what that service is. So we don't build the capacity of an industry to service us. And my poster child, and there's a few slides would have gone up there, is Singapore, because Singapore has had an unwavering vision through Lee Kuan Yew for over 30 years of a city in a garden. So that vision has been unwavering. It's not the only vision. We can have other visions. The governance is brought together through a garden city committee that brings everything from the Jurong Development Corporation to NParks to the table to deliver a common goal around a city in a garden. And capacity, actually building institutional frameworks that deliver capacity. So it is possible, but it does require that unwavering commitment. So that's an introduction to green infrastructure, and each of the speakers or panellists will say a few words. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Can I borrow your thing on? Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me just see if I can... I'm going to be talking down my front in order to get to the microphone. I know people always say they're very pleased to be here. I am very pleased to be here because the green infrastructure thing, especially the urban green infrastructure thing, seems to me at the moment to be bleeping red, so to speak. And the reason it is urgent seems to me to relate to an idea that I call green seduction. I've noticed there's an architect, a Danish architect actually called Bjarke Ingels, who runs quite a famous architecture firm in the States called BIG, which uses his initials, and he calls it pragmatic utopian architecture, and talks about the ideal of hedonistic sustainability, but it's the same notion really, which is that if sustainability is going to take hold, which seems to me to be still a question, if it's going to take hold in a big enough way, quickly enough, then it's going to have to be not just the right thing to do and the moral approach and the sensible thing, but actually beautiful as well. Because humans, above all, are primates, and primates are seduced more easily than they're persuaded, sadly, or perhaps happily. So it seems to me that the relationship between green and infrastructure is an opportunity to bring romance and poetry back into questions of survival, which is why I think it's interesting as well as important. There are any number of studies, as you will know, demonstrating that green stuff is good for well-being, human well-being in particular, that people heal faster, when they can see green space, they work better, They are happier, better balanced, commit fewer crimes, although Stephen and I were talking about this before and I was casting doubt on, in my usual fashion, on some of those studies. But nevertheless, it's clear that being around green stuff makes you feel better, which is good. But, and I think there is a big but there, that sort of thinking takes you very quickly to exactly the kind of thinking that spawned suburbia. And the whole suburban sprawl thing of almost exactly 100 years ago was generated by the idea that green space was good for you, in particular good for children, and that the idea of being able to kick a ball in the grass and not get rickets and get lots of sunshine and eat apples off the trees actually sent all of the urban poor out into the burbs. Some might say that one of the reasons was to free up inner city land for development, but I wouldn't suggest such a cynical interpretation, although of course that happened in Sydney. And some might also say, and there's this interesting stuff about this, which is a footnote, that one of the real reasons for the huge suburban sprawl push of 100 years ago was actually an evangelistic idea that keeping women closeted in suburbia would be the best way of getting men out of cities at night and avoiding the nasty, things like casinos and theatre and actresses and all the dangers therein. Nevertheless, that's also an interesting thing. But it seems to me that what this points to is not just an interesting conflict between what's good for the individual and what's good for the collective, which is fairly standard political stuff, but also a conflict which seems to me to be splitting the green movement, although it's not really recognised at this point, which is a conflict between those who think that we all need to live to grow our own food and therefore need to be surrounded by essentially what amounts really to suburban development. We all need to have vegetable gardens and chooks and that stuff. And therefore we all need to have separate houses surrounded by green stuff where we grow our own food, which is a sort of frontierist edge to the green movement, but an awful lot of green thinkers have that background. And the opposite of that, which is exemplified by people like Edward Glaser, who you might know, who's a professor of economics. I think his title is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard, who says, and has written a number of books, including one called The Triumph of the City, who says that the greenest way to live is the city, and that New York, Manhattan in particular, is the greenest living pattern on Earth. So there's it seems to me that's an interesting conflict. And in the slide is Helena Norberg Hodge, who exemplifies to some extent the agrarian, agriculturalist end of that dualism. That this is Ladakh, where she's done a lot of her work, which is the kind of pattern that she has in her mind for a future living pattern for the human race, right? This is another version of it, which is, Bali, but it's the idea that in the ratio of built stuff to void is definitely winning. And when I say void, of course, I mean green stuff, but the absence of building. Edward Glaser's version might look a bit more like this, which is actually in London, or like this, which is Sydney. If I don't know if I can point to it, but in the centre, the tallest, greenest bit in the centre is actually Central Park in Sydney, which is on the old brewery site, which some people might know. And we'll come back to that in a minute, because it's an interesting example of how urbanism and green infrastructure might come together. Helena Norberg Hodge has a critique of globalism which is absolutely persuasive, and her film, which is called, I think, The Economics of Happiness, argues very strongly that for a zillion different reasons, including political and economic ones, we need to live a lifestyle which is not just green in the abstract, but green in the particular, like the images of Ladakh, for example. Whereas Glaser argues that, and I quote, "The city is where humanity shines most brightly." In other words, it's not just an environmentalist and survival argument, it's also cultural, that the cities, and there's a lot of studies on this as well, and arguments in this direction, that cities are our cultural founts, as well as, in his view, and arguably in mine, our environmental saviour for the future. So he argues that urban agriculture, as it's known, or as it's sort of practiced to date, which is just really fledgling, is likely to cost more in environmental and carbon terms than it saves. So that's an issue. It seems to me that's a real issue for the green movement, which hasn't really been addressed. He sums this up saying, all that is grassy is not green. And that brings us to the dreaded D word, density, which nobody ever wants to talk about with regard to cities. But cities are about density. They are about proximity, and not just density of built stuff, but density of humanity. Humans being close together, rubbing shoulders, you know, getting cross with each other, and being sort of rubbed, if you like, into creativity. Cities put us close to each other, and that is their essence, its core. So I agree with Glaser that the city is essential to our future, but I would disagree with him because I personally have this idea that sometime in the future I'm going to have chooks on my roof, you know, or sheep or something. I'm going to have this green little farm on my roof. So what I would like to argue is that there is actually a middle way, that we can have intense green stuff and intense urban development at the same time, and that they can work together in ways which have yet to be explored. And that this middle way is probably the most interesting and creative kind of future we can imagine. This is one of my favourite landscape designers is Professor of Landscape at what still calls itself, I believe, Peking University, although it's in Beijing. But this is a campus, which is a productive campus. It's actually a rice paddy that he did on the Peking University campus as part of an experiment, actually about 10 years ago. It's quite old for these sorts of things. Professor Kongjian Yu is his name, as some of you will know. But I also am interested in the question of how you make green spaces, the difference between gardens, if you like, and parks. And I'm using those words carefully to suggest that a garden is a room, really, and whereas a park is just a front lawn, it's just an open space without definition, and it's that sense of walledness which is crucial. These are gardens. This is Chicago Botanic Gardens. This is Eaton Square in London, which strikes me as being a very interesting living pattern because it's very dense and also very green. When I say very dense, it's 8 stories. Depends. Some of it's 6 and some of it's 8. But it also has these very luscious gardens as the sort of centrepiece of the residential area right in the middle of London. And this is, of course, Central Park, which is also, in my definition, a room, a green room. And I think that's why it works so well. We constantly use Central Park, we do a lot in Sydney at least, as an example of, you know, everyone says, oh, it's just like Central Park, you know, it's just like, it's really the same. But actually, nothing's like Central Park because nothing, you know, the way that that the park is carved out. Of course, it was carved out before the buildings arrived, but it was never as carved out by Olmsted from the grid. And so it's developed into this wonderful room. And that makes it essentially urban, which is to say an intense interaction between the green stuff and the brown stuff in order to make an enchantment which is wholly invented. It's not natural in any kind of found sense at all. It is entirely artifact. And I think that's wonderful and definitely something to be emulated. Whereas this is definitely a park and not a garden. This is Barangaroo in Sydney, and I can't get a red dot on it, but the green stuff is our illustrious former Prime Minister Paul Keating's idea of how to deal with the headland, and he sees it as a recreation of nature. We've got those nice fake sandstone rocks around the edge, and underneath the grass is a building, including some car parking, in a very Sydney way. So nothing's actually going to grow very tall, but that's not the worst thing about it. The worst thing about it, in my view, is that it is just another piece of grass on the harbour. It's, you know, we put all the building on the back and all of the grass on the front, and it's essentially like a suburban house with a big front lawn. You might as well have a Hills hoist, really. Okay, so enough bagging the Prime Minister. This is Central Park in Sydney, the big development that I showed you before. Jean Nouvel is the architect for the biggest bits and the greenest bits. And I was talking to the architect, one of the architects working on it in Sydney the other day, and I was saying, is that green stuff actually going to work? You know, because it's got this wonderful growing, hanging garden kind of thing. It's also got this massive heliostat which is reflecting sunlight into the south-facing garden. And he said, well, we hope so. And so we all hope so. But we will see within a year, it should actually look like that. At the moment, the building's halfway up, really. So come to Sydney in a year's time, have a look, I suggest. So the future that I'm suggesting might look a little bit like this, which is Ravine City, an idea for, obviously, for intense interplay of the built and the green. It might look like this, which is by RDV, a Dutch firm, it's called Pig City, because each of these buildings produces enough food for 50,000 people. So this is urban agriculture in one of its various forms, and another image that could be a possible one for the future. This is actually Britt Anderson's entry for the Future City show, which was on at the Venice Biennale last year, showing Australian urbanism to the world. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously it's a little bit approximate. It's not exactly cut and dried in terms of its measured drawings, but it strikes me as being an interesting image for how the future might actually start to make the green and the built interact in a way that is intensive and intensely cultural. I've stopped. Stop looking at your watch, Steve. Very good.
I only looked once.
Yeah, okay, that's it.
When I saw you with your last slide.
Yeah, that's the last slide.
Thank you. Enrique.
Okay.
And we won't be able to have people talk, so I have to ask you to be quite quick. So I will look at my watch. No, but I want you to talk now.
I think the term is fire away.
It's for 15 minutes, so
Yeah, I was reading. I know, it's shameless. But you already spoke.
no. So we are talking about urban parks, we're talking about cities, we're talking about human habitats. So I believe in human habitats. We have to do whatever is most propitious for human happiness, I disagree respectfully with Stephen when he says that green infrastructure is what has the most chlorophyll. No. For example, maybe it's more natural in parks not to mow lawns, but if we don't mow the lawns, probably people will not be very attractive to be there. We have to do, that's not very environmental perhaps, but this is what it takes for people to be able to be there, to play, to lay down, to use so, because if we have a forest in the middle of the city, this may not be used at all. It may be very nice, like a piece of art, but this is not what we are talking about. In parks, people spend most of the time in hard surfaces. People stay in the hard surfaces where you can walk more comfortably. You would like to see the green around, but most of the people, except for a few, when they go, even when they walk or take a carriage, a baby carriage, a stroller, a wheelchair, they prefer. So, I don't know, I am not saying what should be or what should not be done. People love trees, we love trees, so if we love trees and we want to have more trees, so we need more trees in the park. If this is going to attract more people. In some weather, where it's cool, maybe to have too many trees will not be, on the contrary, will not attract people, by the contrary. The criteria is what will attract people. Now, to finish and relate to what Elizabeth says, I agree that the issue really is, the great challenge is how to find the density that we want, which as she says, there is a third way. She even said it, that we have not yet found. And clearly, what Mr. Glazer says is that he loves New York, and this is the example. And I really think the big problem with density is that when we talk of density, here in Adelaide, for example, we talk of putting bigger buildings in the CBD. And this is, we must remember that people went to the suburbs precisely because they did not like to be in environments like the CBD. This is why they went to the suburbs, and it's not all of a sudden that people changed. So, of course, it's wonderful if some people want to live in Manhattan and in the suburbs, young people, mostly young people or people without children and all this, but this is not what will create the dense Australian city of the future. It's not just about putting some tall towers in some abandoned industrial site in a brownfield development and to increase. No, this is fine and wonderful, but this is not what will change the structure of Australian and American and Canadian cities. What will change the structure is a new kind of density, which Elizabeth even described, that ways which we have not yet explored, which is exactly what I tried to refer to in my presentation, is a different city which will be high density, but will have a lot of green. We'll have the children will be able to go into pedestrian spaces. They will be able to be 90% of the time in pedestrian spaces. There will be maybe greenways which will crisscross the city, hundreds of kilometers of greenways, hundreds of kilometers of pedestrian and bicycle only streets, hundreds of kilometers of streets only for buses and pedestrians and bicycles, or trams, pedestrians and bicycles, is this new design. And there is also, in terms of management, in terms of, it's a totally different way of achieving this. In order, and I finish, in order to achieve the traditional density, and in some cases you have really a fantastic opportunity, which is very easy, because here in Adelaide, for example, you have 40 kilometers of urban park front. But so, I was in some meeting with some excellent people, very revolutionary, very daring, were saying maybe they will allow 4 to 8 story high buildings. Imagine, do you think Central Park would work if we would have 4 story high buildings? Clearly no, maybe we'll need to have maybe 20 or 30 story high buildings next to these 40 kilometers of park fronts. But this is achieved only changing regulations, allowing people to do the buildings. Government doesn't have to do anything else. That's easy for the mayor. You only have to, maybe there is a lot of discussion, but you only have to change regulations. The other city, the new way which Elizabeth is talking about, which have not yet been explored, I think will have to be redoing completely, demolishing 300 hectares, for example, in a project, or 500 hectares of inner suburb, and redesigning it completely. And there you will need a government or public-private corporation, which will have to be proactive. And just one last thing, when we think it's very sinful and very impossible to think that we're going to demolish houses to put a building in suburbs, I like to tell you, every city where you see buildings, in Manhattan or in CBD, or there were houses before. There were houses before which were demolished there, except that we demolished them in a very dumb way, with only private criteria. This was a redevelopment, but not with a public goal in mind, but with a private interest in mind. So we demolished each house to put a big building, but there was no increase in green, no increase in sidewalks, no increase in anything. So what now we are proposing is to do something much more with a public perspective, with the objective of creating that new density, which will give the people who live in suburbs those things they seek in suburbs, that green they seek in suburbs, plus the density, which is neither the current suburbs nor the Manhattan or CBD structure.
Now,
I'm happy to go straight away. Can I
Go.
start? Right. Hopefully I'm going to be the first mayor to be given 5 minutes and speak for less. We'll see how we go. Look, I think one of the really important principles of the future of cities is that we are going very much back to localised management. So going from the macro back to the micro. So whether it's food generation with community gardens, whether it's waste management with worm farms and dealing with things in local communities, water capture and reuse on site, and of course even things like electricity generation now with solar panels or cogeneration or tri-generation. You know, there's a really important and powerful principle which is about saying that cities are going to be dealt with on a neighbourhood by neighbourhood and precinct by precinct basis, even to the point of business improvement districts and precinct management groups and community groups. And so for me, one of the things that I really wanted to, I guess, challenge people is this rethinking of cities within that framework, which actually then says that not only is green infrastructure important, but that in fact the grey infrastructure we have must go on a journey to actually be green infrastructure. Just as there's a wonderful sort of comment, there is no such thing as waste, it's all a resource. We need to start thinking there should be no such thing as grey infrastructure. It should be green infrastructure, and so that journey is really important. And I just wanted to cite a couple of examples. For those of you who are in Adelaide, you know we've got a wonderfully active and vocal Parklands Preservation Society. And I once said to a couple of the Parklands Preservation Society members, I wonder what the speed limit's going to be in the parklands. And they really didn't understand what I was talking about until I mentioned that electric bikes are very much going to become a predominant part of transport, and that ultimately our greenways are also going to become the freeways of the future. And you can imagine, and I can't see too many Adelaide people in there, otherwise I'd be grinning from ear to ear, but you can imagine them absolutely shaking in their boots and thinking, hang on, you know, our open space would never be a freeway. But you know, there are things like that that are going to make a really big difference. Another couple of examples, and I really encourage you to walk around Adelaide, but also walk around your own communities and look at all the grey infrastructure we have. You know, 30% or more of our cities are bitumen, 30%. And ultimately, we're starting to learn that as cities grow, become 2, 3, 4 million, that you just can't physically move people with cars. It's mathematically impossible. I'll give you a quick example. Adelaide has 200,000 people come in and out of the CBD every single day, and we have 43,000 car parks in our city. Melbourne's got 30,000 car parks in its city, and it has 800,000 people move in and out of its CBD every day. So, you know, cities are not going to be about roads in the future. Cities are going to be about moving people, and there are much more efficient ways of doing that. So, you know, look at Victoria Square, the heart of our city, which frankly I've publicly said is a national disgrace. You know, 49% of our major square in South Australia is bitumen. 49%, and no one ever wants to go there. And of course, when we talk about building a new square, people say, well, as long as there's a road that goes through the middle of it. Then you visit every single one of our squares in the city of Adelaide, and they have all been completely carved up by roads. Now, why are footpaths just bitumen or paving? You know, why aren't they permeable surfaces? Why don't they have, why is not every single street tree lined? Why is every single street have water capture areas where the water runs off and is actually collected locally and supports the plants? Why are not all our roads green corridors? I used to work in the open space unit here in our state planning authority, and when I was young, had a big Barney with the head of strategic planning when I insisted that King William Street should be a part of our metropolitan open space system. He said, don't be ridiculous. But you know, if it's connecting the parklands from north to south with Victoria Square in the middle, you know, why is that not an ecological corridor? Why is that not an area where, for example, the tram lines could be all grass or all native vegetation? And why aren't we thinking of our roads as part of that green infrastructure? And all the other squares. Another example is Highmarsh Square, where we've got the road going straight through the middle, but we've also got huge amounts of bitumen that provide car parking for about 50 or 60 car parks. Now we've got residential high-rise towers there, and we tried some activation and put some container crates in there and tables and chairs, and the residents went berserk because we put places where you could buy food and tables and chairs outside. They wanted their car parks back. What if we ripped up that bitumen and put a park outside, right outside their house? Are they going to get angry because they've lost their car parks, or are they going to be happy because we've created green space right outside their door? At the moment, people are going to be angry because they're losing their right, their individual right to drive a car. So, you know, a lot of it has to do with creating spaces that are actually going to be food producing, water management, those sorts of things. You know, so much bitumen, so many opportunities, let's face it. And some of the examples we've had before are really visionary, but if you're in local government, there's a $20,000 project there, there's a $100,000 project there. You know, we need to be getting out there with a spray can and actually starting to draw in areas that we could sort of take a bit more bitumen out, put a bit more landscaping in, and systematically do this. And if you aim to reduce the amount of bitumen by 1% each year, in 30 years' time you've got 30% less bitumen, and you've got a nicer place for more people to spend more time. So, you know, I really think that you know, there are some really practical, incremental, small-scale interventions that we really consistently need to be exploring. And for me, the future is really going back to, and excuse the pun, but going back to our grassroots. And frankly, I think that we're at a stage now where we really need to be saying that everything that is new is green again.
Great, thanks. We're over to questions. Alan Holmes. Look, there is someone with a microphone. Oh, okay,
Oh,
good.
good. Excellent.
Steve and I have to have a crack in a way.
Isn't state government and council meant to be working together?
Yeah, I know. So, one of the great flaws of us Adelaideans is that we talk and don't do. And Enrique, in 5 years, transformed his city. And I suppose, so for me, what is it that will get us to do things rather than talk about things?
Yeah. It's interesting, Alan. Great question. I have to say I've become half programmed like a town planner and half programmed like a community leader, and it's a different way of thinking. I think you know, Adelaide is still thinking like a country town, and our transport patterns are like that, and everyone wants progress, but no one wants change. And so there's a whole pile of things. One of the things that I've learned is the Splash Adelaide program we've done, which is the temporary trial stuff. Fantastic example. We're consulting by doing. So we've just marched in, we haven't told a soul, we've closed down a laneway, we've put tables and chairs out, we've rolled out some fake grass matting, and we've put table tennis tables out, and the community have just come along the next day and been engaged in that process of just incrementally doing it. It was very successful. 50% of the daily users of the City of Adelaide are under the age of 30. They love it, but the old school person who spent their entire life looking out of a car window has been violently angry that they've lost a car park here or there when we've got 42,000 car parks. So a big believer, they've done it in New York, where you just get out there and you start putting up bollards, you start painting the roads, and it costs nothing, well, 20 grand, where you'd normally spend $1.5 million. And if you don't get it right, you send the boys in, they move it around. If you don't get it right, you send the boys back, they move it around, and eventually you get it right. And then you start investing in the capital, permanent capital work. So I think that's a good example. And also, you know, being brave and some leadership. You know, it's a really challenging one. I think for me, a big part of it is communication. We've got to educate the media. We've got to get them on board. You know, when journalists interview journalists about what the Lord Mayor thinks about cars and transport, and they just bag it, it's so depressing, it's beyond belief. And we've got to get these people, you know, up to speed with what the contemporary issues are facing cities in the 21st century. So some of the trial projects are important. I think a good communication strategy is really important, and I think we really just need, you know, I think the communication's a big one. We had a great transport strategy. It's just that Chapter 7 should have been how do we communicate this? Where's our YouTube clip? Where's our social media strategy?
It's a very good question. I'd be interested in the other panellists' views, but are there some other questions?
There's one down the back there.
Oh, there is apparently one down the back that
Thanks. My name's Damien Burgess. I'm from Melbourne. I work in local government, and one of the things that strikes me is parks and open space, recreation, probably not recreation, but parks and open space are often within the portfolio of engineering, other activities like that, asset management, and inevitably, and correct me if I'm wrong, in other people's experience, the person at the top of that tree, or the second level, general manager, director level, is often an engineer. And often parks fall sort of under the purview of the engineer, and roads and changing, seeking opportunities to change what's black and flat to green. That's often where the biggest hurdle lies. So I'm interested in your view, Stephen, as the mayor. What capacity have the elected officials got to influence that change at the executive level and the staff in the organisation, which is still, a hard sort of nut to crack, if you like, in terms of changing some of the thinking about at the higher level?
Yeah, once again, I'd say education is a big part of it. We're spoiled at the City of Adelaide. Whenever there are international experts in town, we steal them for a breakfast, and we educate the councillors and we educate the senior executive. Also, I'm a big believer in motivation and understanding how to influence people, and I think it's got to be around educating people. I'm not afraid to get a team to fly to Melbourne to look at what they're doing, or get an international expert in and get that third-party endorsement as well. Those sorts of things are really important. I think engineers are being challenged now in that traditional way, and I think there's some really good work happening in cities all over the world that are, once again, it's those small interventions where you can actually demonstrate to people that it works that I think is the real challenge. Rundle Street's another example. We're just upgrading the northern footpath, and half the businesses were outraged that they're losing 9 car parks. But we're also trying to actively demonstrate that replacing it with outdoor dining, with trees, with landscaping is going to bring thousands more people. I think what we need to do is document this stuff and have those stories to tell, because people just don't believe it until they see it. And it's not really the engineers. What I think we need to, the constant challenge is, I've knocked on every single business door in this entire city, and frankly, businesses don't care. They don't care about green space. They don't care about making the city a nicer place. They just want more car parks, and they want more people to come into the city in a single car and park outside their business. And we've got to engage those people. My challenge to everyone is talk to people who don't agree with you, not the ones that do.
Yeah.
I'd just like to add something to that. I, for my sins, was a councillor in Sydney for 4 years, and when we were elected as independents, we found that exactly what you were saying, that the engineers are running the show, and every single aesthetic decision in the city, from tree planting to street signs to street furniture to park management, everything was done by the engineers. And although I have a great affection for engineers as a general species, local government engineers are a very particular animal, and we found they work best in a very small box, actually, when poked with a sharp stick. In fact, Sydney has changed a lot, and that was actually 20 years ago when I was first elected, and since that time, the approach to design has changed dramatically. And getting designers running design is actually really important. I mean, their designers have their faults, God knows, but getting landscape designers and architects and urban designers on top of those aesthetic decisions in cities, I think, is really important and can work really well. So, yeah, hear it for designers. I mean, careful with engineers. I know they're delicate, but
Oh, and in fact, can I just reinforce that? That was probably a better answer in the sense that we've got the Integrated Design
I'm
Commission.
not sure if you can substitute your answer.
No, with your own one.
No, but absolutely the design approach is what the City of Adelaide's been doing through the Integrated Design Commission as well. So getting the designers to start running the show within a certain, to a certain level.
Yeah, up to a point.
Yeah,
but always up to a point.
Also, I think we need to get the right people to run. We need the right leaders. We need influence leaders.
Absolutely.
So, Enrique, how did you achieve? Because your change was wholesale
And huge.
and huge.
Yeah.
So you could answer Alan's question and go, well, how did you do it?
Well,
Bulletproof vest.
Each society is different, each government is different, the institutions are different, not necessarily, but I think one thing that must be clear is that new ideas are never born with majority support. As the mayor says, change is difficult, always difficult, and of course you have first to try to promote a vision. Second, you have to identify specific projects. You cannot just stay in the vision. You have to identify specific projects. And then you will have to make decisions even when you don't have support by everyone. You will have to take risk. At some point, you must take risk if you're going to change things. And of course, all the good arguments are important. For example, now I was mentioning the engineers issue. Clearly, for example, most of the discussion really is about how to distribute, how to use this most valuable resource a city has, which is road space. Road space is like a treasure. How to distribute this between pedestrians, bicycles, public transport, and cars. One thing that must be clear is that there is no such a thing as a natural level of car use in a city. If there was more space for cars in New York or in London or in Paris, there would be more cars.
Yes.
If there was less space, there would be less cars, as simple as that. So, this is a political decision. If you take away parking space and make bigger sidewalks and protected bicycle ways, this is not something you have to ask the traffic engineers permission for. This is not a technical decision, but a political decision.
Yeah.
And this is why I mentioned in my presentation that we must remember that in all constitutions there are many rights. Right to education, right to health, but parking is not a constitutional right in any constitution that I know of.
Other questions? Yeah.
I'm going to be cheeky and ask a question, because one of the things that strikes me about the conversation is that, in a sense, we're lumping things together that maybe should be pulled apart. The problems that you confront in creating greener spaces and, if you like, greener infrastructure in an inner city are very different from those in the already built suburbs, are different again from the problems you confront with new developers. And the tensions in each case are different as well. And yet I think we are often transposing solutions from one part of that complex into others. To give you an example, in my hometown of Fremantle, which is a superb example of a Victorian streetscape with a lot of buildings to go with it, the local council have decided in their wisdom that in order to get greener outcomes, they want to build 10-storey buildings in the middle of that space, as if it's going to make any difference to the overall density of the city, while meanwhile Perth continues to sprawl in all of the new developments. So I'd be interested in your observations about how we, in a sense, make sure that the solutions that we're proposing to increase green space, improve density, are not the wrong ones. These enthusiastic, young, progressive, green councillors who are about to commit some terrible sins, and I've seen it happen elsewhere. And as a coder, one of the problems, I think, is that when people are observing the solutions that are on offer, they sometimes see some pretty awful architecture. So Elizabeth, maybe you might like to comment as well on that. That we don't have very good models for improving the ratios, if you like, and some of them don't look very nice at all.
Look, you're right. It's extremely difficult. The infill question is probably the most difficult question facing Australian cities in particular. It's easier in cases like Central Park on Broadway in Sydney, where you have a massive former industrial site, although it wasn't empty, and there were, and still are, some heritage buildings, and some that were knocked down possibly shouldn't have been knocked down. But of course it's always going to be most difficult when you're knocking down people's houses, as Enrique has said. I'm not sure that it isn't nevertheless sometimes the right thing to do. I'm actually, I love Fremantle. I think it's one of the prettiest places in the country. And yet I can see the Greens' argument for doing that. I think we are very architecture shy in this country for all kinds of good reasons, mainly because most of what's been built in the last 50 years is rubbish. And so people quite rightly think that anything new, and especially anything new and big, is going to be worse than what exists, because generally that's the case. Yeah, that's a big hurdle to get over. It doesn't necessarily in itself mean that density is the wrong thing, or that you shouldn't sometimes take the pain. I mean, I live in Redfern in the centre of Sydney, and I would be very upset, of course, if my house was knocked down. But I can nevertheless see the arguments that southern bit of Sydney Central is, if density is going to go anywhere, that's the place for it. And there's Green Square, and there's all sorts of big developments happening around, and there's a lot of controversy, quite rightly. But I think that's where that thing that I was trying to talk about, green seduction, comes in, because that the architects and designers' responsibility to do things that are beautiful is very important. It's not just something that, oh yes, it's lovely if it's beautiful, but it doesn't really matter. It actually matters profoundly to ordinary people that things are made that are lovely. And I think that if I could stress anything to our architects, it would be that. Make it gorgeous in order to persuade people that what's new isn't necessarily dreadful.
If I could just make a very quick comment. The ironies that a green counts on increasing building heights in an urban centre.
But that's great, though.
I know. Oh, look, it is
brave.
good. It is good. And I just 10 years ago, I think it's really fascinating in the sense that 10 years ago, if that conversation had been having, people would have said, "You're crazy. That would never happen." Look, I think a big part of this is about providing choice. And at the moment, for example, in Adelaide, 85% of all housing in metropolitan Adelaide is low density, and there isn't that choice and diversity. And that, for me, is a really serious problem in the sense that there are people 60 and 70 and 80 years old who are still living in 3-bedroom houses because they don't have the options or the choice, and we don't have people moving. And so, we've grown up in a society where you just assume you're going to live in low density in the suburbs. And we don't have that choice. Whether it's 5 stories or 6 stories, which many people, certainly in Scandinavia, are advocating as a much more sustainable model, or 10 stories or 20 stories, is really up to the architecture, the functioning of the urban system, and a whole, the materials you use, and a whole range of things. But that's the density conversation's a fascinating one in Australia, where people just, virtually no Australians live in apartments, certainly in Adelaide. And so having that choice is a good thing. Where we put it, I guess, and how we develop it is the challenge.
So, Enrique?
Just to mention that things change. We must remember that when I don't know Fremantle at all, but I'm sure when this part of Fremantle that you talk about was built, there were no cars.
It's lovely.
So things change. So we also must be very careful. I saw the other day a wonderful documentary about the Chauvet Caves. Beautiful art, amazing paintings by people who clearly had the intelligent, the sensitivity. They were exactly like us, or the artists. They had the abstraction. This was 32,000 years ago. Now, we must be very careful with this heritage story, because when we talk about something that we are to keep, it's not for the next 30 years. It's for the next 3,000 years, if not the next 30,000 years. Do we really have such jewels of civilization that we really have to keep for 3,000 or 5,000 years? Of course, some things, yes, but we have to be very careful. I'm not so much talking of downtown, but especially the inner suburbs, because of course the older houses are always in the inner suburbs, which is where density will have to go. We have to be very careful. Now, I would say that more important, again, than height of buildings is what happens when the buildings reach the ground. What happens? Will it improve? Clearly, if you allow somebody to have 10-story high buildings and not 2, you should have better sidewalks. You should have improved the space around it that will make it more attractive to be in, to talk, to play, all of this. And just one last comment about the demolishing of houses, because this is nothing new. Even there is, in terms of demolition, there was a very interesting, for those interested in this issue, it went to the US Supreme Court with the land of capitalism in a case in New London, Connecticut, about 5 years ago. And the US Supreme Court supported that. This is done in Australia all the time. They demolish houses all the time. And this is nothing new. They use eminent domain to make roads, to make ports, to make airports. I mean, this is nothing very new or created. And this is done in Europe all the time. So, and besides, the people, why do we demolish a house to make room for a road? Because clearly there are arguments that socially, for the whole society of Australia, is better. I mean, because there is one basic point in democracy, which is that public good prevails over private interest. And so if it's necessary, so if we come to the conclusion that for environmental reasons, economic development reasons, quality of life reasons, this is what's best for the majority, this is basic democracy. Plus, people will make a lot of money if these kind of things are done. They will be able to sell their houses maybe for twice what they are worth today. They will not have to go. They will just have to maybe live there in a higher. I mean, but and this this has been done all over the world. I mean, these kinds of things have been done in many places in Europe. This is nothing very. But each society has to decide what they want.
Okay, I think we're pretty well out of time. Unless there's anyone desperate with a question, I'll hand over to Carmen. So thanks very much, Lord Mayor Stephen Yellowwood and Elizabeth Farrelly and Enrique Penalosa. And I was completely thrown by your watch, which is about 17 minutes ahead of mine.
Oh.